Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Today is Monday. We are now approximately 2 weeks away from expansion. So I thought now it was the time. Now it was the time to start with our first tier list, our first ranking of the specs and the classes for the upcoming expansion. As I said just a few days ago, it is very difficult to make rankings or tier lists for the expansion because we simply have too much of a complicated system of talents. The simulations are not nearly accurate or simply are not there altogether. So trying to gauge who is strong or not is near impossible right now. Plus, Blizzard is not helping by constantly laying out serious nerfs or buffs to multiple specs every other day. It makes it even harder to gauge who is strong or not, which is why those type of discussions are very, very volatile right now. So the perfect way to start to make a tier list or to make a ranking is to simply look at history, is to simply gauge who has a higher chance of being strong by looking at 4 years, nearly 4 years, multiple seasons of Mythic Plus, for example, worth of value, worth of how meta they were, how flavor of the month they were, for how long have they been powerful, just to gauge what are the chances going to be for each and every one of the specs or classes to be strong in the next expansion. Because ultimately it's the most accurate thing we can do right now. Trying to gauge who is going to be strong just by the beta tuning is near impossible, so let's just base ourselves on the facts of the past for all of these specs. For example, just to lay you into the data right away, these are the specs values and strengths of the past 6 seasons and multiple years worth of Mythic Plus for tanks and for healers. It might surprise some people, of course, perhaps the ones that did not play back in BFA or did not care about Mythic Plus, for example, that Blood Death Knight had been, up to this point, up to this last season 3 of Shadowlands, the worst, basically the worst tank for Mythic Plus, right? And now it's much stronger. Same goes for healers. Even though Restoration Druid had fallen out a bit, in Shadowlands they were the best healer for the entirety of BFA. Meanwhile, the opposite goes for Holy. Holy, despite being very good in Season 3 of Shadowlands, they were the worst healer in the entirety of BFA. So this gives you an idea of the average strength of each and every one of the specs throughout the history of the last couple of expansions of Mythic Plus. We can do the same for the melee DPS as well. You might see some familiar faces in here, like Outlaw, Windwalker, and Havoc Demon Hunter being very high up. Perhaps you might not have remembered Assassination Rogue being as good as this ranking implies. And also at the bottom, you have Feral, you have Retribution, Arms Warrior, Enhancement Shaman are not very surprising positions. Even Survival, I guess, shouldn't really take many players by surprise because more or less anyone knew that before this last season, the one that counts, I'm not counting Season 4, this last season of Shadowlands, Survival was a meme, right? So it was basically all the way at the bottom. And lastly, you have the range DPS. Now this might surprise even more people than usual, because you start at the bottom with some familiar faces like Arcane, like Affliction, like Demonology, even Distraction. Sure, as you see them getting first in Season 3, it's not a surprise that previously they were very weak. You also see Marksmanship, that low might surprise some people. You always have this feeling that players seem to think that Marksmanship is always OP or something, but not really. Frost Mage, Beast Mastery, Hunter, Balanced Druid, and then you enter the top 3, and then you have Shadow Priest. This is perhaps the first surprise of many players to see Shadow Priest even remotely considered powerful in Mythic Plus. Followed by Fire Mage. This is definitely not the surprise of the player base to see Fire Mage very good. And lastly, the biggest of the surprise probably goes to Elemental Shaman, who is, according to the rankings of the last 6 seasons of Mythic Plus, the overall best range DPS in Mythic Plus. Now, it's not exactly true, we will see later why, but at the very least, just at face value, they were doing fine. In fact, this last season of Shadowlands was the worst of the seasons for Elemental Shaman in terms of balance, in terms of meta. Now, what if we put all of the specs together? Because, okay, cool, the melee DPS were ranked against the other melee DPS, and the ranged DPS were ranked against the ranged DPS. But this is not really how it works in Mythic Plus. Maybe in the raid you might have some limitations in how many ranged DPS you want to bring compared to the much fewer melee DPS you want to bring, but in Mythic Plus, not really. Usually in Mythic Plus you just bring who does most damage, you just bring who is the strongest one. So why don't we just look at the DPS and how they have been all against each other. You can see the familiar faces of all of the top 3 melee DPS staying top 3, even when compared, even when put against the ranged DPS. Outlaw, Windwalker and Havoc are still at the top. You do see, for example, Fire Mage passing Elemental and Balanced Druid, despite being below Elemental in the ranged DPS only, once paired together with the melee DPS, and you get the average of their ranking. But overall, not too surprising. You have at the bottom some very familiar faces, as we have pointed out, like Feral, Arcane, Arms, Survival, Wrath, Affliction. They have been historically quite bad. Now, these are just the specs. So this is what the specs are telling us are historically in terms of power in Mythic Plus. What about, though, this time in an expansion, right before the release of a new one, where you're starting to think to play a different class or a new class or to reroll, etc, etc, you might want to be playing multiple specs, you might want to be playing all of the specs available to a class. It's not that you are interested just in how powerful Frost Mage is. You are willing to play Arcane or Fire if they are meta, for example, in the raid or in Mythic Plus. So we can look not just at the strength of each of the specs, but we can also look at the strength of each of the classes. Now, looking at the strength of each of the classes individually doesn't really change for tanks and healers, obviously. There is only one tank spec per class, and there is only one healer spec per class, with the exception of Holy and Discipline, which, once merged together, still stay above Mistweaver. So there isn't really any change there. What about the DPS, however? If you start taking all of the rogue specs together and you merge them, you merge warriors, DKs, hunters, mages, warlocks, and see how they average out. The result is that rogue gets even stronger, of course, because outlaw was ranked 2nd, 1st, 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 5th, and 3rd. Meanwhile, now, with all of the specs combined for rogue, you have 2nd, 1st, 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 and 3rd. Why? Because in the 2nd season of Shadowlands, where Outlaw was slacking, who wasn't slacking was Subtlety, which was the best melee DPS and the best DPS spec in Mythic Plus. That's why Rogue becomes even stronger. Windwalker doesn't really change because they only had one spec to begin with. Havoc Demon Hunter is the same, and so do all of the other 4 classes with just one melee DPS spec, like Enhancement, Survival, Wrath, and Feral. And then we go back to the talk about Elemental Shaman. Now Elemental is no longer first, because once you put all of the 3 mage specs together and the 2 hunter specs together, because they can of course plug the holes. When one spec is weak, another one can pick up the slack. For example, in BFA Season 2, Fire Mage was 10. It was one of the worst of the DPS. Now, once you take all mage specs together, the mage spec can simply go and play Frost, which was doing much better than Fire, for example. Meanwhile, Elemental doesn't really have that choice. Elemental can only play Elemental if you want to play a ranged DPS as a Shaman. Of course, the more surprising out of all of this is Warlock. Because Warlock, much like Rogue, who is first, and much like Mage, who is first for ranged DPS, Warlock also has 3 specs. Warlock also has the ability to choose amongst 3 different choices, and yet they were consistently trash for most of Mythic Plus, with the exception of this last season, in Season 3, with the Destruction Warlock buffs from their double legendary and, more importantly, from their tier set. But besides that season, Warlock has never been quite highly rated when it comes to Mythic Plus. We can then do the same treatment that we did for the specs, which is to put all of the ranged and the melee DPS together. We don't just rate them in their 2 individual categories, we take them all at once, and we still see Rogue being ahead of every other class, followed by Windwalker, which surprisingly still keeps up despite being just 1 spec, followed by Mage, Havoc, and then Druid, Hunter, Shaman, Priest, and then Warrior, DK. Warlock no longer at the bottom, and then Retribution, Paladin, who has been consistently the worst DPS class in the game for Mythic Plus. Basically, they were last for the entirety of Shadowlands. They were 2nd to last in the last 2 seasons of BFA and 3rd to last in the 2nd season of BFA. So overall, if you wanted to look at a class to play in Dragonflight for Mythic Plus, focusing on Mythic Plus and focusing on DPS, for example, these have been the historical values of each of the classes in terms of their power, their meta state in Mythic Plus. TLDR, Rogue for melee DPS, and Mage for range DPS, which I'm sure many of you could have guessed even without going through all of these spreadsheets if asked which spec to play if you want to make sure you are meta. Of course, many people will just answer, just play one of the pure DPS classes, right? They have 3 specs, they have 3 chances at being meta. It's of course going to be much safer than playing a Shadow Priest. You know, if the tuning is wrong, then Shadow Priest is in the garbage bin because they have no spec to reroll to. However, as we can see from here, it's not nearly as true, because Windwalker and Havoc are in the top 4. Consistently, they have been either in the top 2 or top 3 for melee DPS, or in the top 4 for all of the DPS specs and classes. So, specs with multiple options, like Warrior with Arms and Fury, like Death Knight with Unholy and Frost, or like Warlock with 3 different specs to choose from, have still consistently been below Havoc and Windwalker. So I guess the answer is much less just play a class with multiple specs to choose from, and rather just play the class with multiple specs to choose from named Rogue or named Mage. Otherwise, focus on Windwalker and Havoc. You can also see, as highlighted here, the differences in power, the shifts in power, something we might go and look at after the first few weeks of Dragonflight Mythic Plus, for example, to see how further this changes. For example, Protection Warrior has had a massive fall-off from BFA. In Shadowlands, they were the weakest tank, where in BFA they were the strongest tank, so of course, for them, it was a disaster. For healers, there was something similar, because Druid was the best healer in BFA and went out to be the 2nd to 3rd worst healer in Shadowlands for a long time. Similarly, Restoration Shaman had an inverse treatment. They became one of the better healers in Shadowlands when they were one of the weaker ones in BFA. And then you have the whole list about the changes in power of the DPS from one expansion to the next. So this is more useful just to look at, in the future, in the near future, when we start looking at the situation inside of Dragonflight, how further this is changing. Like, for example, if Assassination Rogue will continue to be the worst, or to continue to have the worst fall off compared to all the other DPS, or if Survival and Arcane Mage will continue to improve compared to their state in BFA after they improved so much in Shadowlands. But this is mostly, as I said, just a guideline. What we can finish with instead is the actual historical tier list with the spec strength and the class strength. Because what we saw here is just the ranking. So how did they finish at the end of the season? We don't actually know how much more powerful they were or how much less powerful they were. For example, in one season, Outlaw could have been first with a power level of 100, and Fire Mage would have been second with a power level of 99. Meanwhile, the season after, Fire Mage could have been first with a power level of 100, while Outlaw could have been second with a power level of 90. So in the end, all you see is Outlaw first and second, and Fire Mage second and first, but their difference in power was much different, was much larger, right? So this is what this ranking is going to show, just the difference in how much more or less powerful they were, not just their simple rank at the end of a season. And this is what we have overall. So the main changes from just looking at the ranking is that Fire Mage is slightly better, while at the same time Feral Druid becomes much better than before compared to just their ranking. There is a massive fallout, a massive fall-off for Subtlety Rogue, who goes from halfway through the middle towards the bottom, and that's because Subtlety, as you see from the very bright red markings it has, when Subtlety was bad, they were really bad, so they lose a lot in power. You also have BM Hunter being a little bit higher than just their ranking suggests, because BM Hunter almost has as an opposite. When they are strong, they are very strong because they are quite oppressive with their scaling and their numbers and their board powers in some cases. So this has been the overall spec strength in the last 6 seasons and some 3 years of Mythic Plus, in terms of how powerful they were and also how powerful compared to the other specs in Mythic Plus. We can also finish once again with the opposite of this, which isn't the spec power but the class power, because as we said, it might be very important to many players who just don't care too much about Outlaw, but they care more about Rogue. They don't care too much about Fire Mage, they care more about Mage. All of the class, not just one spec. And this is the result. Rogue and Mage. The answer, the TLDR of what you should play in Mythic Plus if you want to be meta, who have the highest chance in an expansion where we can't quite tell, we can't quite see tier lists and rankings based on beta numbers and simulations because it's much too random and much too volatile. Based on history, the highest chance you have at being meta in Mythic Plus is by playing Rogue and Mage, and if you want to hurt yourself, is by playing Paladin, Death Knight and Warlock. This has been the historical likelihood of each and every spec or each and every class to be meta, viable, flavor of the month, call it however you want, in Mythic Plus. And I believe this is for the moment just about the best we can do in trying to dish out to provide the players and the viewers with some rankings and tier lists for the expansion, because it's just too random right now. I could have made, for example, a tier list of tanks a few days ago, and just now Guardian Druid received a gigantic buff, and then Vengeance was nerfed, and then Blood Death Knight was nerfed, and then Prot Warrior was slightly nerfed. That tier list would have gone down in flames. The same could be said for healers. We just got a significant set of damage buffs for Restoration Shaman, for example. Holy Priest was just nerfed in healing and in damage as well, so it's much more risky to make tier lists or to even listen to any of these tier lists right now. So I thought the best to start with, at the very least, when trying to look at which specs are going to be strong in Dragonflight or have a chance to be popular and viable and meta, was to start with what history taught us, what we have already seen being popular and strong in Mythic Plus in years worth, in seasons worth of data. So this is what we have for the start of the week. The first tier list, the first ranking of Dragonflight comes in the form of previous experiences. With this said and done, it's time to leave each other on this worst day of the week, on this Monday. Starting, of course, by thanking all of my patrons for supporting me and contributing to the growth of this channel. You can, of course, still, no shame, support by not having to spend money you have so greedily kept for your favorite e-girl by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Those are still completely money-free options. Then, lastly, for more social interactions, you can follow me on Twitter, as well as subscribing to my Patreon, which will also give you access to my Discord server as well. If you ever want to pop by, ask a few questions, maybe give some feedback about the content you have just seen or the future content you would like to see, that's where you can find me as well. With this said and done, it's time to leave each other. Thank you guys again for watching. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I don't know, man. I know data, facts, and logic are a good thing to go by, but when you tell me to trust Shadow Priest more than the entirety of the Warlock class, you know, really?